Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another Stronghold Crusader build. In the last video we built a birdhouse. In the last Stronghold Crusader Builds episode we built the Barracks and the Armory, and back then we were still in the dark ages before the Stronghold Crusader Definitive Edition released, so let's enjoy these historical recordings of our little settlement. We built the Barracks and the Armory in that episode because our small hamlet is growing steadily, and with the latest thievery that was going on in the granary, I've decided that we need some soldiers to keep the peasants in check. But the thieves among us are not the only reason why some protection would be helpful. Sometimes at night when I'm in a deep slumber, dreaming about past adventures, I get woken up all of a sudden by the roar of a mountain lion not far from our settlement. And our slowly increasing gold reserves might attract some bandits or other rulers. Also, we have the finest maidens in town, you can be sure about that. So there is no doubt that we should start producing some weapons and train some soldiers as soon as possible. Some archers would be really handy to have, or maybe even some knights, but our gold reserves are good, but not insanely good. So the cheapest weapon to produce is the spear, because it only uses one piece of wood, and a bow, for example, uses 2 pieces. The Poleturner's workshop only costs 10 wood and 100 gold instead of the 20 wood and 100 gold the Fletcher's workshop costs. The guerdon, I hope this is the right term, I'm not sure, but the guerdon of the Spearmen is only 8 gold, and for the archer it's 12 gold. And the title of this video is the Poleturner's workshop from Stronghold Crusader, so we should start by making that one. Okay, let's take a look at the in-game building, and because of the Definitive Edition, I can actually tell what most of the details are supposed to be, and this Poleturner's workshop has quite a few interesting details. The most obvious one and the heart piece of the Poleturner's workshop is the foot-powered Woodlathe right here. There is a workbench with a wooden mallet, a draw knife and a pike blade. We can see a grindstone, which I believe is also foot powered, and on the left side here is a bucket with something inside. I'm not 100% sure what this is supposed to be, but I'm assuming that the bucket is here to clean up the wood shavings, so it has a handheld broom and dustpan inside. I'm really excited to tackle all the smaller details, but like in every other Stronghold Crusader build, the main building is the first one on the list, so I started with cutting some sticks to size with my bandsaw. I decided that for this basic structure the sticks should be 8x8mm thick, and I started off with cutting them to length on my self-made saw guide. I wanted to connect this frame with half-lap joints, and by clamping these sticks onto the board I wanted to make sure that everything is square. Once the glue has dried a little, I marked the center of the half-lap joints to drill a hole in there and to connect the corner poles to the frame. This hole is round, this knob is square, but with super glue we don't have to care. On the in-game building we can see these 45-degree braces on every pole, and to be able to cut these 4x4mm sticks with my cutting guide, I used a piece of scrap wood that I cut in a 45-degree angle. I had to take this guide or rail or fence or whatever off to cut 8 tiny cross braces, and now it's time for my standard burning the wood to make it look old method. The main frame was easy to scrub with a wire brush, but for these small pieces I used an abrasive handpad and my tiny saw to cut some grooves in there. Here you can see the comparison. It doesn't make a huge difference, but I still think this one looks more realistic. I glued them on there by eye, and now we have a really flat building, but it is also like that in the game. I mean, come on, the Poleturner can barely stand in there. But now that we are already here, we can see that this workshop doesn't have real walls all around the building, it only has these 2 half walls. The wooden parts are obviously made out of wood, and for the white parts I wanted to use my good old arch enemy Mr. Gypsum. For the wooden parts I started with cutting some slots into the corner poles for the sticks that go across here, and at first I wanted to make one big slice of gypsum and glue these vertical sticks on top of it, but then I decided to make singular gypsum pieces divided by these sticks. but at the same time making a mold for every single gypsum piece seemed very annoying to me, so my plan was to simply make one big brick for now and later cut it to size. I made this simple frame out of some MFC boards where the gypsum doesn't stick to, and as always I wasn't really sure how much I need to fill up this mold, so I simply put 1 cup of water in this old milk pot, added 1 cup of gypsum powder and mixed it. Then I remembered that the ratio should be 1 part water to 2 parts gypsum powder, so I made way too much and had to pour the excess into this cookie container. That's definitely not ideal, but I don't know, maybe I'll be able to use this on a future project. On the next day the gypsum was ready to be taken out of the mold, then I cleaned the edges a little bit with an old cutter knife blade and cut off the part I needed with a saw. The walls are way thinner than this piece, so I cut it into 3 slices and used an old chisel to get a nice smooth surface. While doing this chisel work I've realized that I glued the horizontal sticks onto the wrong side of the building, so I had to redo that, and I tried to patch up these slots, but they are not looking all that great. Once that was fixed, I cut 1 gypsum piece to size using my bandsaw blade gypsum saw and cut a half lap joint for the vertical stick. Glue the stick in, glue the gypsum part in, and this is definitely not holding very well, but I continued to do that for the rest of the building, and I actually really like how this turned out. For the roof I could have calculated these angles, but I don't like calculating angles, so instead I traced the side of the building onto a sheet of paper and drew the rest of the poles on there as well. To connect the 2 poles with a half lap joint, I marked where they cross each other, cut out this section and glued them together like this. Once I glued them onto the building, I was beginning to think about how to connect them in the middle, and at first I wanted to add a pole like this and cut it to this angle, but then I looked at the in-game building again and saw that this X up here would make the roof look very different. I decided to connect them with a beam in the middle instead, and to further secure it I drilled a hole through the joint and the beam and glued the stick in there. Hey guys, a short intermission here. I am editing this video right now and I've realized that I forgot this pole in the middle here. I was mostly working with the open roof version because I can see all the details, but here you obviously can't see the roof anymore. So I completely forgot to add this pole. It is pretty much on brand for me because it wouldn't be one of my videos if I had not forgotten to add something. But yeah, let's just continue. The next step of the main building would be this part up here, but that is a part of the Woodlathe, and at that time I hadn't thought one bit about how to build it, so I continued with the other details. The workbench seems to be covered in wooden planks, so I wanted to make a frame like this first, that I can then cover with wooden strips. I started, again with cutting some sticks to size, and the first steps for the table frame are pretty much the same as the ones for the main building, just smaller. So making a frame with half lap joints, marking the center to drill a hole in there, and cutting off these portions from the bench legs until only this little knob is left. I was a little afraid to cut out these mortises because the piece is only holding together on this quarter, but everything worked out fine. To support the planks on the back of the angles, I decided to glue some extra strips in here, mark the angle and cut it out with an X-Acto blade. After gluing all the wooden boards on there, the only thing left was to adjust the color of the workbench, and for that I used my steel wool vinegar stain. Let's put this workbench aside for now to dry and continue with the foot-powered whetstone. I started again with cutting some sticks to size, and the process is pretty much the same as the other two, but once again one step smaller. The half lap joint frame with holes on the corners is as big as the tip of my finger here, and I also made the 4 corner poles with knobs again and connected them with half lap joints on the bottom. Then I glued them together and added 1 cross brace in the front here and 1 on the back. And if you're looking at it like this, it seems pretty square, but from the top view it is not looking so square. As the whetstone, I used an old piece of dried gypsum. I don't really know which project this is from, but after shaving off a little bit, we can clearly see that it's a mixture of the white gypsum and the slow drying plaster mixture I'm using sometimes. I drew a circle on there and slowly started to cut it out, first with the saw and then with the cutter knife. The whetstone should be able to rotate around the middle axis, and for that I had to drill a hole in the center. I sadly couldn't find the center point from the caliper anymore, so I had to do this circle center finding method. It works by drawing a line somewhere on the side, marking the middle and drawing a perpendicular line from that point. Then do it again on another side, and if you were precise enough, and the circle is really a circle, the crossing point of these two lines should be the center of the circle. If you are unsure, you can do it a third time, like I did, and then simply estimate the middle. This should be close enough for my standards, and the whetstone didn't even break while drilling, so that's a win in my book. I drilled the hole this big in here because my initial thought was to cut off these parts, put a square stick through the whetstone and make the square stick round on the ends so everything can still rotate. But there was just too little space inside this box, so I put a round stick with the hole in the center through here instead and used a wire as the axis. To be able to turn the wire, we need this little bend here, and with another wire that is going to be connected to the foot pedal, we can rotate this whetstone like this. Once it is inside the frame, we can cut the wire to length, bend it 90 degrees and start to make the pedal. I'm normally using some thin sheet metal in this situation, but this time I wanted to use something even thinner, so I used an aluminum wire that I hammered flat on the vise first, then bent it around this wire and the pedal. When making the other side, I obviously broke the part and had to make it again, but now we can connect the pedal to the whetstone and it is turning. We still need a turning point on the back of the pedal, so I made these two parts and this bent wire that can be put through the pedal and the base plate, and then be secured with these two parts that I nailed onto the base plate as well. Okay, this is working pretty good, but because the whetstone doesn't have enough mass, it is not working how it is supposed to work. In real life you would push the pedal down and that rotates the stone halfway. Then the rotational force of the stone would lift the pedal back up and makes it tip over this point here to push it down again, and so on. But for a miniature model I think this level of functionality is okay. I covered the frame and the floor with wooden boards and then used my wood stain to adjust the wood color again. By the way, as a comparison, this is how the workbench was looking after one day. Okay, so now after the whetstone is done, I guess I can no longer avoid the heartpiece of the Poleturner's workshop, the Woodlathe. Looking at the in-game building, we can see some distinct features. The big spinning wheel and the pedal are both connected to this part that I'm going to call the tension stick. Here it is looking really elastic, almost like a rubber band. And maybe I'm thinking about this too much again, but I think I know why it is looking a little bit off. Let's assume this is a wooden plank that has been tapered on the front and is now being pulled down by the pedal. That means it should bend a little around this radius, and that means from this perspective it has to look shorter. Here in game it goes straight up and down, which makes it look like the pole is getting stretched, but maybe I'm wrong, and I'm sure that nobody even cares about this if they're playing the game like a normal person would. But let's go back to the function. The tension stick is pulling the pedal and the spinning wheel up by default. So if the Poleturner pushes down the pedal, it pulls down the tension stick and the big spinning wheel, and once he releases the pedal, the wheel and the pedal are being pulled back up. The large spinning wheel is held in place by these two poles, and the spear handle is clamped somehow in between here. I'm not really sure how, but it doesn't look like this pole has any rotating features, so it's probably connected to the spinning wheel. On the other side we have two smaller spinning wheels, and I'm once again not really sure why these two wheels are there. A hole in the pole would technically be enough, but one reason I could think of is to balance out the spinning motion of the larger wheel. I'm just suspecting that when the larger wheel is turning this side of the stick, it is very likely to be flung around on the other side, and maybe the weight of these two wheels helps. Or maybe the rotational force of these two wheels is assisting the larger wheel and the tension stick once they're in motion. But once again, these are just my speculations. Because I was so unsure about this, I looked up some videos of medieval wood turning, and most of the lathes didn't have any wheels at all, and turned the workpiece by wrapping a string around it that is connected to the tension stick and the foot pedal. But either way, I'm trying to build the Woodlathe from the Poleturner's workshop in Stronghold Crusader, which means it has to look like this. Let's begin with the easiest part of the Woodlathe first, which are the 3 poles and the base platform. For the poles we need 8x6mm thick sticks, but instead of cutting them on my bandsaw, I used the 8x8mm sticks I used for the main building and simply shaved 2mm off. Then I drilled a hole in there, and looking at the in-game building again, we can see that they are supported by these 2 braces on each side. And to avoid having to measure and cut 2 angles, I only cut the angle on the top, glued the sticks on there and then cut them off at the bottom. And looking at the in-game building again, we can see that the poles are not just stuck into the ground, they are mounted onto a wooden platform. And I thought I can catch 2 birds with 1 stone with this platform. The first one being it has to be there because it is in the game, obviously, and the second one being a problem I created myself because I thought about how the pole stays in the middle, or rather how you put it in there in the first place. And I guess I was thinking about how a modern lathe works and how you can move this side from left to right to clamp the workpiece in there. So that means I had to make some kind of mechanism that lets me move the right pole with the 2 wheels. But on the in-game building we can see nothing like that. So my plan was to build a fake floor in some sense, where the moving parts can be hidden in the ground. For the lowest floor level I glued 3 wooden planks together with 2 low quality wooden planks and cut them to size to then glue 4x4mm sticks around the edges to create a border. Then I glued the right pole onto a piece of wood that fits inside here and can be moved from left to right. Like this it's probably really hard to move without getting it stuck, so I made this version. The pole is still on this tiny board, and this board is mounted onto penis! And once this is all covered up with wooden planks, we should have no trouble at all moving this from left to right. Okay, those were the quote-unquote easy parts, and now we have to make a 180-degree turn to the hardest parts, the 3 wheels. I decided to make them out of hardwood because they are looking pretty thin, but should still be durable enough to drill lots of holes in them. I made 2 slices about 5mm thick for the smaller wheels and 1 slice that's about 8mm thick for the larger wheel. To cut them out I first wanted to use this adjustable hole saw cutter bit that has these grooves here and different diameter cutting blades. But a little problem with these was that the smallest one has a 25mm diameter and my circle has a diameter of 24mm. I still tried it for whatever reason and ended up with one piece looking like this. On the larger wheel I got lucky because the inside radius was 32mm and that's the second smallest for this bit. On this wheel I can now simply cut these pieces off with my bandsaw, but on the smaller wheels I have to get rid of the inside, which worked out exceptionally well. On the next attempt I used a Forstner bit and drilled through about 3/4 of the board on one side and then turned it around to finish the hole. This is supposed to prevent tear out, and it actually did. So now we have 2 tiny wheels, another 2 tiny replacement wheels and 1 large wheel. I also made this part that I turned on the Woodlathe to make the inner ring for the wheels. To mark where the holes are supposed to be, I drew the smaller wheel onto a sheet of paper and divided it into 8 parts or 45 degrees and 12 parts or 30 degrees for the larger wheel. I could have done the same for the middle part of the wheel and drilled them separately, but I used a different approach by putting the two wheels in the right position and gluing them together with two sticks that I can cut away once the spokes are in there. To drill the holes, I simply bent a scrap brass rod round and drilled through the outer and inner wheel, which generally speaking worked out pretty well, except for these two. I really don't know what I did there, but this should still work out. After cleaning them up, we can move on to the next part, and this one was easy to build, but I still had to think about how it should work. We have a wheel right here and a tension stick up here, so we need a connection that looks something like this. In my head this makes sense, because once the tension stick goes back up, it isn't simply lifting up the entire wheel, it is forcing the wheel to rotate around this axis. Once again, the problem sounded kinda complicated in my head, but the parts I made were actually pretty simple. I used two narrow thin sheet metal strips and bent them around a wire, did the same thing with the wider strip and glued it onto the rest piece I used to make the middle section. I was only able to drill 1mm holes into the strips because they are so narrow, and I didn't even have any 1mm nails. So I had to use this wire and hammer it flat on one side to make my own tiny nails. And once the big wheel is done, it's assembly time. I glued the wheels in place, and my plan was to put these two little pieces at the end here, which have a round hole on this side to glue it onto the stick and a square hole on the other side to hold the pole. I added the same part on the bigger wheel, but I actually ended up cutting the square portions of these two parts off because there was already really little space between here, and this distance now still seems really short for a spear handle. The reason for that is that I made this part here and the three individual wheels a bit too wide. As I already said, I left the wheels wider for stability, but this part wouldn't need to be this wide. But to be completely honest, I really didn't want to replace them. And that means clamping a reasonably long stick inside these no longer existing square holes is not longer possible anymore, so I simply superglued it in between here. Okay, this isn't looking all too bad, but one more important part that is still missing is the pedal. Function-wise, this pedal and the whetstone pedal are pretty much the same. I just inverted it by gluing the two outer parts onto the pedal and the middle part onto the base platform. It is looking really chunky and fortified like this, but I wanted to rivet the metal parts on there, and after putting in the pins we have a functioning foot pedal that can be moved together with the big spinning wheel. If we are taking a quick look at the in-game building again, we can see that the color of the spinning wheel, the poles and the spear handle are all different shades of brown. But me, being the genius I am, simply covered them all with my steel wool vinegar stain, which I gotta admit makes the whole lathe look really bland. Also, the parts where the superglue is on the surface got a different color and now it has these weird stains, so I probably shouldn't have done this. It's always sad when a small mistake like this makes the whole project look worse, but there is also no way I'm making it again, so... It is what it is. In order for the lathe to actually work, we still need the tension stick and the parts up here that are holding it in place. Now, I was pretty sure that a wooden slice this thin would break with the first bend, so I thought a green branch would work better. I went outside and cut off a shoot of a persimmon tree. There's no reason why I cut it off that specific tree, I was just searching a flexible stick. To know where the stick needs to be, I have to place the lathe inside the building, but because I made this fake floor, I had to lift up the rest of the building to be on the same level, so I simply added this border around here and a floorboard. Now we can make this contraption that should be really easy, but I made it a little more complicated to make it a little more interesting. First I carved these two shapes out of an 8x8mm stick until I had two pieces like this, and with another thin piece we can clamp the stick in between here. We obviously need to connect these two parts somehow, so I taped them together and drilled two holes. Then I used the turn square stick into round stick method to make these two pins, and to be able to attach this clamp to the roof, I made these two parts that I glued onto this vertical pole. I stripped the bark of this stick, and on this side I have to connect it to the spinning wheel and the pedal, so I made this metal part right here. Here I gotta apologize a little bit for the lighting. I don't know why the footage is looking so dirty, but it's just like that for this stick portion. After gluing and clamping this part around the stick, I thought it would be smart to add another piece of sheet metal around here to prevent the stick from breaking. I glued the stick inside the first clamp and put some glue around the top of the pins just to hold them in place for now. Something that's a little annoying how I build it is the angle of this stick. On the in-game building it seems to be inside the roof or inside the building, but I was afraid that a stick this short wouldn't give me enough range without breaking, so I left it a little bit too long and too thick, but once again I really didn't want it to break. So I had to put some spacers in between here for the front clamp to work properly. And after gluing everything in place, it looked like this. You can see that I already cut the pins off and the super glue would probably hold them in place just fine, but I still added these smaller pins. Then I put a thick wire through there and wrote the sheet metal from the pedal and the spinning wheel around here to have a functioning wood lathe. The range of motion is still not really the best, because in reality you should be able to turn the stick for 360 degrees at least once, but actually I'm still pretty surprised that I was even able to build this. Looking at the in-game building again, we can see that the roof is covered with palm leaves, and we can also see some rafters. So let's add the rafters first, and before adding the greenery, I also covered this contraption up here with the wood stain. Because the entire building is relatively low, the roof is making it really hard to look inside, so I thought about making one side of the roof removable. After making 4 cuts on the rafters and connecting them with 2 sticks, a wooden strip down here and 2 strips up here, I had the really fun realization that this is a dumb idea, so I ended up not using this and simply glued the palm leaves over the entire roof. Speaking of palm leaves, I don't have any, if you believe it or not, and even if I did, they would be way too big. So instead of palm leaves, I used some bamboo leaves that my neighbor kindly sponsored without knowing. I had to make the Timu palm leaves version though, by cutting these wedges out of every leaf. I started with a pair of scissors, which was really slow, but then I switched to the X-Acto blade, and on the last leaves I was kinda getting the hang of it. I made quite a few of these and glued them onto the roof, then cut off the excess and glued these excess pieces on there again to cover up the widest gaps. And that's already it for the roof. Normally I am my biggest criticist, but here I honestly don't know what to think, because I kinda like and dislike how this looks at the same time. But anyways, we still need a floor to finish the main building, and I simply used this mixture of sawdust and gypsum powder just like in the previous episode. After that step we have the main building, the table and the whetstone finished, so now we can hop over to the tinier details scattered all around the building. Let's start with the wooden mallet on the workbench. This one was really easy to make. I used a square stick and drew the rough shape on there, cut it out, then drilled the hole in the middle and glued the stick inside. To make it a little more interesting, I glued a wedge inside the top of the handle, and that's already it. We can also see a pike blade on this workbench that I simply drew onto a piece of sheet metal, cut it out and bent the part where the handle is supposed to be round. I also wanted to sharpen the edges a little bit, and this dark coating of the sheet metal always makes this look more realistic. The third detail on this bench is one of my favorite tools, the draw knife. And I could have used the sheet metal again, but I felt like doing a little quote-unquote forging. Once I was happy with the shape, I filed the handles round and sharpened the edge. Then I glued 2 sticks with a hole inside onto the round metal parts, cut them off in the right length and started to shape them with my X-Acto blade. And now I have a little drawing knife that, to be fair, could be a little sharper, but it's looking pretty good. The poles here on the side are just sticks, so I'm not showing you how I'm cutting them, but over here is another detail, the little bucket. I started with cutting some burnt wooden sticks thinner and... I don't think this ever happened to me before, interesting. But anyways, I cut them so that the stick tapers towards the bottom and tried to cut an angle on the sides as well. Then I cut a little slot here on the bottom for the bottom board, and I made a few more of these pieces and started to glue them around the bottom board one by one. Well, I'm not really proud how this piece turned out, because the bottom board, or short BB, is obviously tilted, but with a bit of sanding it is still tilted. I've also added this metal ring that is holding the individual boards together on the top, and that means I can cut the excess off. After using the Dremel tool to make the top parts thinner and riveting the metal strips together with the tiny nails, this is looking like a bucket. At the beginning of the video I said that I believe this bucket is only here to clean up the wood shavings, so next up we need a little broom. I started by drilling a hole inside a thin stick, then shaped it into this, broom shape and glued a stick inside to make a handle. I wasn't really sure how to make the bristles at first. I think on a real broom they are divided into smaller bunches that are glued inside holes on the bottom here, but I can't really drill holes this tiny into my miniature broom. So I simply used the bristles of an old paintbrush, clamped together this frame and filled it up with the bristles, then I put some tape around here to hold them in place, and finally turned everything around to glue the broom in there. I knew it was going to stick to the frame, but after taking it out and cleaning it up a little, we have a functioning little broom. Last but not least comes the dustpan inside the bucket, and for that one I drew this shape onto a piece of sheet metal. Then I cut it out, and now this portion can be bent up and behind here on both sides, and then the upper part can be bent over the back here to attach the handle. I still had to do a little filing, but with that finished we are done with the details. Well, there is one tiny baby step left, because I still wanted to make all the tools look a little older. So I used my steel wool vinegar stain on them, and after putting everything in place, I can finally present to you the finished Poleturner's workshop, and as always, thanks for watching.